Let me tell you something important. When a man is being dishonest, he doesn't just hide facts. He leaks truth in the way he responds. And most people miss it. Not because they're naive, but because they're asking the wrong kinds of questions. They are safe questions, predictable ones. Questions that give him time to prepare, to charm, to deflect. But the truth comes out when a man is caught off script. So today I'm going to give you 7 questions not to interrogate, not to accuse, but to reveal. Because the right question asked calmly and confidently doesn't just get answers, it exposes patterns. Question 1, what made you think of me right now? This sounds simple, even sweet, but it forces specificity. A genuine man will have a natural answer. A dishonest one will scramble or generalize. Question 2, walk me through your day start to finish. Details are hard to fake consistently. Watch for gaps, contradictions, or irritation at being asked. Question 3, who were you with when that happened? Notice whether he gives clear names or stays vague. Vagueness is often a shield. Question 4, why didn't you tell me that earlier? This question isn't about the event, it's about transparency. His answer reveals whether he values openness or convenience. Question 5, how would you feel if I did the same thing? Now you're shifting perspective. A man who's acting out of integrity will answer thoughtfully. A guilty man may deflect or minimize. Question 6, is there anything you think I'd be upset to find out later? This is powerful. It gives him a chance to come clean. Watch closely. His reaction matters more than his words. Question 7, do you feel you've been completely honest with me? And then let him sit in it. People reveal the most when they feel the weight of their own answer. Now, here's the key. This isn't about catching someone in a lie like it's a game. It's about observing behavior. Does he get defensive or reflective? Does he try to connect or control the narrative? Does he answer or avoid? Because a man who is genuine doesn't fear clarity. And a man who is hiding something, he doesn't just slip up once he creates a pattern of discomfort, inconsistency, and deflection. Your job is not to chase the truth. Your job is to create the space where the truth has nowhere to hide. And when you do that, you won't need to force anything. He'll reveal himself. Most people assume that getting the truth is about asking more questions, but it's actually about asking better ones. There's a big difference. When questions are predictable or emotionally charged, they give the other person a clear path to defend themselves, avoid details, or tell you exactly what they think you want to hear. For example, yes or no questions or accusations tend to shut people down or push them into performance mode where they focus more on managing your reaction than telling the truth. On the other hand, well-crafted questions create a subtle kind of pressure, not aggressive pressure, but psychological pressure that makes it harder for someone to stay consistent if they're being dishonest. These questions invite explanation rather than defense, which is where cracks begin to show. The key is in how the question is framed. Open-ended questions require a person to think, recall, and construct an answer in real time. That process is easy when someone is being genuine because their memory supports them. But when someone is hiding something, that same process becomes much more difficult. They have to calculate what to say, what to leave out, and how to make it believable all at once. That's where hesitation, inconsistency, or over-explaining can creep in. Even subtle shifts in tone or body language can reveal discomfort. Another important factor is emotional neutrality. When a question is asked calmly without accusation, it lowers the other person's guard. They don't feel immediately attacked, which means they're less prepared to defend themselves. This makes their response more spontaneous and therefore more revealing. If a question feels loaded or hostile, the person is far more likely to become guarded, making it harder to distinguish truth from deflection. Timing also matters. Asking a thoughtful question at an unexpected moment can catch someone off script. When people don't have time to prepare or rehearse, their answers tend to reflect what's actually going on rather than what they've planned to say. This doesn't mean trying to trap someone, but rather understanding that authenticity shows up most clearly in unfiltered moments. Ultimately, the effectiveness of a question lies in its ability to create clarity. It gently removes the space where vague answers can hide and replaces it with a need for coherence and detail. When that happens, truth becomes easier to recognize, not because it's forced out, but because there's less room for anything else to survive. Honesty has a certain ease to it. When someone is telling the truth, they don't have to work very hard to maintain their story because it already exists in their memory. Their answers tend to be clear, direct, and consistent. Even if they don't include every tiny detail, there's a natural flow in the way they explain things, and they don't seem overly concerned with how every word is being perceived. That doesn't mean they won't pause to think or reflect, but their pauses feel genuine rather than calculated. You'll notice that they stay relatively steady in their tone and don't feel the need to constantly adjust their narrative. In contrast, dishonesty often introduces friction. A man who is hiding something usually leans on vagueness because it gives him flexibility. The less specific he is, the easier it becomes to shift his story later if needed. Instead of saying exactly where he was or who he was with, he might use broad language, skip over key details, or redirect the focus entirely. This isn't always obvious at first. It can come across as casual or even relaxed. But over time, the lack of clarity starts to stand out, especially when you compare different conversations. Deflection is another common pattern. Rather than answering a question directly, he may respond with another question, make a joke, or turn the attention back onto you. Sometimes it's subtle, like slightly changing the subject or giving an answer that sounds relevant but doesn't actually address what was asked. Other times, it's more noticeable, like becoming defensive or irritated. The goal isn't always to lie outright often. It's simply to avoid being pinned down to something concrete. What's important to understand is that this behavior is rarely about one isolated response. Anyone can be vague or distracted. Occasionally, the difference shows up in consistency. An honest man, even when uncomfortable, tends to circle back to clarity. A dishonest one tends to drift further into ambiguity the more he talks. You might notice small contradictions, details that don't quite align, or a pattern where answers feel incomplete. It's also worth paying attention to how much effort is being put into the explanation. Overly polished answers or stories that seem too carefully constructed can sometimes signal that more thought is going into managing the impression than simply telling the truth. On the other hand, straightforward responses, even if imperfect, often carry a sense of authenticity because they're not trying to be anything other than what they are. Specific open-ended questions have a way of pulling someone out of autopilot and into real-time thinking. Unlike closed questions that can be answered with a simple yes or no, open-ended ones require a person to explain, describe, and connect details. That process might seem ordinary on the surface, but it's actually where inconsistencies begin to surface. If someone isn't being truthful, when a person is telling the truth, their memory naturally supports them. They can recall events with a reasonable level of detail, and even if they don't remember everything perfectly, their story tends to stay aligned because it's grounded in something real. When someone is being dishonest, however, they're not recalling, it's constructing. Construction requires effort. They have to think about what sounds believable, what fits with what they've said before, and what won't raise suspicion. The more specific the question, the harder it becomes to maintain the construction without cracks appearing. For example, asking, "What did you do last night?" might get a smooth general answer. But asking, "What time did you leave? Who were you with? And what did you do after that?" forces a sequence. It introduces structure, and structure is where false narratives often struggle. Another important aspect is that open-ended questions remove the ability to hide behind minimal responses. A vague answer stands out more when the question clearly invites detail. If someone consistently avoids specifics, skips over parts of the story, or gives answers that feel incomplete, it becomes easier to notice a pattern. Even small inconsistencies like changing timelines, unclear transitions, or missing connections can start to add up when the conversation requires depth. It's also in the follow-up where things become revealing. When you gently ask for clarification or revisit a detail later, a truthful account tends to remain stable. A dishonest one may shift slightly, adding or removing elements to keep the story intact. These changes might be subtle, but they create a sense that something isn't fully aligned. The more layers you add through thoughtful questioning, the more difficult it becomes to keep everything consistent. What makes this approach effective isn't intensity or pressure. It's precision. You're not overwhelming someone with accusations. You're simply creating a space where clarity is expected. And when clarity becomes the standard, anything that doesn't quite fit begins to stand out on its own. Words can be carefully chosen, edited, and shaped to create a certain impression, but reactions are much harder to control in the moment. That's why paying attention to how someone responds often reveals more than what they actually say. When a person is being truthful, their reaction tends to match the situation. If a question is reasonable, their response usually feels proportionate, calm, thoughtful, and willing to engage. Even if they feel slightly uncomfortable, they don't immediately jump into defense mode because they don't perceive the question as a threat. On the other hand, defensiveness can be a subtle signal that something deeper is going on. It doesn't always look like anger. Sometimes it shows up as irritation, sarcasm, or a quick shift in tone. A simple question might be met with, "Why are you asking me that?" or "Don't you trust me?" Responses that redirect attention away from the original question and onto your intent instead. This kind of reaction can be telling because it suggests the person is more focused on protecting themselves than providing clarity. Irritation is another response worth noticing, especially when it seems disproportionate to the situation. If someone becomes unusually annoyed by a straightforward question, it may indicate that the question has touched on something they'd rather avoid. This doesn't automatically mean dishonesty, but when irritation appears repeatedly around certain topics, it can signal discomfort that goes beyond the surface. Avoidance can be even more subtle. Instead of reacting strongly, a person might give an answer that sounds acceptable but doesn't fully address what was asked. They might change the subject, give partial information, or speak in a way that feels slightly off topic. Over time, these small moments of avoidance can form a pattern where conversations never quite reach full clarity. It's important to look at these reactions in context rather than isolating a single moment. Everyone can feel defensive or distracted at times. What matters is consistency. If a person regularly responds to reasonable questions with deflection, irritation, or avoidance, it begins to paint a clearer picture. These reactions often happen instinctively before someone has time to fully manage them, which is why they can be so revealing. By focusing on behavior instead of just words, you start to see what someone is actually communicating beneath the surface. Most people underestimate how powerful it is to simply give someone the opportunity to be honest without pressure. When you create a space where a person doesn't feel immediately attacked or cornered, something interesting happens. Their guard lowers. Instead of going into defense mode, they're more likely to reflect, even if just for a moment, on what they've said or done. That pause can be incredibly revealing because it shifts the dynamic from confrontation to self-awareness. When someone feels judged or accused, their instinct is often to protect themselves. That protection can look like denial, deflection, or even counter-attacking. But when the tone is calm and the question is framed in a way that invites honesty rather than demands it, the pressure changes. It's no longer about winning or avoiding blame. It becomes about whether they choose to step into transparency. This is where you might see hesitation, a change in body language, or a more thoughtful response than before. There's also a psychological effect at play when you explicitly give someone room to come clean. Questions like, is there anything I should know? Or is there something you haven't told me yet? Don't accuse, they invite. And that invitation can create an internal conflict for someone who isn't being fully truthful. On one hand, they have the option to continue hiding things. On the other, they're being given a clear, non-confrontational chance to be honest. That tension can lead to subtle signs, long pauses, nervous shifts, or partial admissions that indicate something more is beneath the surface. Silence plays a crucial role here as well. After asking a meaningful question, resisting the urge to fill the gap can make a big difference. Silence creates space, and in that space, people often feel the need to respond more fully. If someone is hiding something, that silence can feel uncomfortable, which sometimes leads them to over-explain or reveal more than they initially intended. If they're being honest, they're usually more at ease with that quiet moment because they're not trying to manage anything. What makes this approach effective is that it doesn't rely on force. You're not pushing someone into a corner or trying to extract a confession. Instead, you're observing what they do when given the chance to be open. And in many cases, what a person chooses to reveal or avoid revealing when the door to honesty is wide open can tell you far more than any direct accusation ever could. It's easy to get caught up in a single moment, one strange answer, one awkward pause, one reaction that doesn't feel quite right, and immediately try to draw a conclusion from it. But the reality is, isolated incidents rarely tell the full story. People have off days. They get distracted. They miscommunicate. That's why the real insight doesn't come from one response. It comes from patterns that develop over time. When you step back and observe behavior across multiple interactions, you start to see consistency, or the lack of it. Patterns reveal what isolated moments can't. If someone is generally open, clear, and consistent, then one vague answer doesn't carry much weight. But if vagueness shows up repeatedly, especially around similar topics, it starts to form a recognizable trend. The same goes for defensiveness, avoidance, or changing details. When these behaviors appear again and again, they stop looking like coincidence and start looking like strategy. Consistency is one of the strongest indicators of honesty. A truthful person doesn't have to remember a script. Their account remains relatively stable because it's rooted in actual experience. Even if minor details shift, the core of what they're saying stays the same. In contrast, when someone is being dishonest, maintaining that consistency becomes increasingly difficult over time. Small discrepancies begin to emerge. Timelines that don't quite match, details that get added or removed, or explanations that evolve depending on the situation. Another important element is how behavior aligns with words. Someone might say all the right things in one conversation, but if their actions repeatedly contradict those words, that mismatch becomes part of the pattern. For example, promising transparency but consistently avoiding certain questions creates a disconnect that's hard to ignore when viewed over time. Observing patterns also requires patience and emotional discipline. It means resisting the urge to jump to immediate conclusions and instead allowing enough time for behavior to reveal itself. This doesn't mean ignoring red flags, it means placing them in context. When you look at the bigger picture, you're less likely to be misled by charm in one moment or thrown off by confusion in another. Over time, patterns create clarity. They remove the need to guess or overanalyze individual situations because the overall behavior begins to speak for itself in a way that's much harder to dismiss or explain away. Thank you for taking the time to listen, to reflect, and to invest in understanding not just others, but your own awareness and standards. I appreciate you being here. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time.